Hi there, this is another revision video that I'm going to do on gas exchange in insects. It did cause a little bit of confusion when I studied it with my class earlier on in the year, and some of you may find this useful. So, this is what is known as the tracheal system. Okay, so the gas exchange in insects is via this tracheal system. So insects have this system of pipes. Essentially, these are all pipes that become ever increasing in their surface area. So they branch and branch and branch, and those pipes are open at the end, and they can carry the air from the atmosphere. So if this is the atmosphere out here, and they carry that air directly to the respiring tissues. The respiring tissues inside the insect, which might be a muscle, for example. Okay, just before we go on, it's really worth remembering that just as with all of these gas exchange systems and with exchange generally, it's worth reminding ourselves of this. It's Fick's law. So Fick's law states that the rate of diffusion is proportional to three things. So the surface area multiplied by the concentration difference, or the concentration gradient, divided by the distance of diffusion. So to achieve a greater rate of diffusion, so if we want to increase the rate of diffusion, it's important to increase or to have a large surface area. To maintain or to some way increase the concentration difference, and to minimize the distance of diffusion. And as we go through and as we look at the tracheal system in insects, we'll see how each of those factors is accounted for. Okay, so this is what we're going to do: describe the structure of the gas exchange system, explain how it functions. Okay, so we've mentioned this already. There are a system of pipes that make up the tracheal system. That tracheal system is connected to the atmosphere. Okay, there are holes in the sides generally of insects that are called, have a look over here on the notes, these are called spiracles. Okay, so spiracles are present on the surface of the insects, and they can be opened and closed. We'll explain why they open and close later, but they open to allow gas exchange, to allow air containing a higher concentration of oxygen in, and to move air containing a higher concentration of carbon dioxide out. Those spiracles have valves, okay, and those valves are necessary to reduce the water loss. So the spiracles are not open at all times, because it's really important that water is retained. Okay, from the spiracles then at the surface, we enter this tracheal system, this system of pipes that becomes increasingly branched until it reaches the, as we said earlier on, the respiring tissues of the insect. So the reason that a specialised gas exchange surface is necessary is because, just like other arthropods and invertebrates, they have a exoskeleton. And that exoskeleton is made up of this molecule called chitin. Sometimes some students pronounce that differently, it's up to you. But chitin is very similar to cellulose. But you'll notice down here that chitin contains nitrogen. And there have been A-level questions in the past asking for a comparison between cellulose and chitin. Now you don't need to know the structure of chitin, the structure of the monomers, but it's worth noting that they contain nitrogen. And anyway, that chitin is waterproof. Now waterproof is great because it means that it can reduce the water loss as long as those spiracles are closed. But it's also very tough and provides a protection to the organs and to the tissues inside. So this is a little bit of this is a look at what is on the surface then of an insect. It's a caterpillar. We can see on that caterpillar that there are these holes on the surface, and those holes under a microscope look like this, and this is a spiracle. Okay, so the spiracles can be opened and closed to allow for gas exchange when they're open and to prevent water loss when they are closed. Okay, the opening and closing of that spiracle depends on the levels of carbon dioxide inside the insect's body. So when carbon dioxide levels increase, or the concentration of carbon dioxide increases, that causes the spiracles to open wider. And that increases the rate of diffusion of gases. And then compare that to at rest. So when the insect is at rest, carbon dioxide concentrations decrease, the spiracles tend to close, and that will reduce the water loss. So they open and close according to the concentration of carbon dioxide. Okay, let's have a look. We'll have a look at the tracheal system in a bit more detail then. So at the surface, here we can see, I don't know if you can see that on the video, this is the spiracle on the surface. The spiracle branches into what's known as the trachea. The trachea are the branches, the larger branches of these tubes, and they continue to branch until eventually they become very fine tubes called, and these ones down here, these are called tracheals. And it's the tracheals with all their many fine branches which increase the surface area. So we think back to Fick's law, that's increasing the surface area with the tracheals. Okay, another point here, we've got those tracheals which extend directly into the respiring tissues. So they allow the movement of air from the surface through the trachea into the tracheals directly to the respiring tissues. And this is where gas exchange takes place. So that reduces the distance of diffusion. Again, go back to Fick's law. We want a short distance of diffusion for a fast rate. Okay, so at the respiring tissues, oxygen moves out of that air that's in the tracheals and diffuses. So we've got diffusion here of oxygen into the respiring tissues. Those respiring tissues, through aerobic respiration, produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction from the respiring tissues into the tracheals, into the trachea, and then out through the spiracles. Okay, so here we can see them again, labelled. So spiracles at the surface, trachea, tracheals, and then those tracheals branch all the way down to the muscle fibres. Okay, this is a locust, and we can see that in the body plan of a locust. So we can see the spiracles on the surface, here and here and here, branching in first into the tracheae, and then we can see these really fine tracheals all the way down into the into the respiring tissues. Okay, so spiracles have valves. Mentioned this before. They close to reduce the water loss by evaporation. Commonly, questions might ask you about those spiracles. What is their function? Why is it necessary that they have a valve? And really, there are two things, aren't there? So they need to close to reduce the water loss, but they open to allow for air to move in to the trachea and air to move out. The air moving in has a high concentration of oxygen, air moving out has a high concentration of carbon dioxide. So, there is ventilation in insects. Okay, that ventilation accounts for the third part, or the third factor in Fick's law. So the concentration difference. Okay, so in insects, muscles contract, which change the volume of the trachea. Sorry, of the tracheals. So we get volume changes in the tracheals. So the volume if the volume increases, the pressure would decrease. If the volume decreases, the pressure would increase. So when there is a large volume in the tracheals, there is a low pressure that forces air from a high pressure in the atmosphere into the trachea and into the tracheals and to the exchange surface, so to the respiring tissues. When the pressure, or when the volume decreases, the pressure increases. We now have a higher pressure in the tracheals than in the atmosphere, so air is forced out of the trachea. Okay, and there are some videos, other videos on YouTube that demonstrate that. Unfortunately, I don't have any insects or any locusts to show this, but you can look at those that link if you want. Okay, now this is mentioned in your notes. Okay, and it often causes a bit of confusion. So in very large insects, such as the locusts, or bees, for example, they have this method of ventilation where muscles are able to compress the tracheal system, which forces air out, and relax, which, as I mentioned before, allows air to move in. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. Okay, so we can see these muscles, these longitudinal muscles, so these are muscles that run down the length of the insect. When those muscles relax, the space that they take up decreases, and that allows for the tracheal system to increase in volume. Okay, so these longitudinal muscles relax, And these muscles that are sort of top to bottom in the latitudinal maybe of the insect, they contract. But we can see here the volume here has increased. So if the volume increases, that means that the pressure will decrease. So when we have a lower pressure here, we now have a pressure gradient. So there is a higher pressure in the atmosphere, a lower pressure in the trachea. So air moves down that pressure gradient from the higher pressure in the atmosphere to the lower pressure in the trachea. Okay, so air is moved in. This ventilation maintains a high concentration gradient of oxygen. So there is a higher concentration of oxygen in this air that just moved in from the atmosphere. And that oxygen can then diffuse into the muscles and be used for aerobic respiration. There is also a lower concentration of carbon dioxide in this air, lower than the carbon dioxide in the muscles, so the carbon dioxide moves that way. So let's label that. Let's show. There's another colour here. Okay, so we've got a high concentration of oxygen, and just another one over here, low concentration of CO2. So oxygen diffuses from the tracheals and into the muscles. Carbon dioxide goes the other way. Okay, so we say then that ventilation, and this is true of all animals that have a ventilation system, so that ventilation maintains the concentration gradient for the exchange of oxygen or carbon dioxide. Okay, so if you just go back to our original Fick's law, large surface area we've mentioned, short distance of diffusion we've mentioned, now we've just mentioned the concentration difference or concentration gradient via ventilation. So where did I put that? There it is down there. Okay, so that is air moving in. The opposite effect of that is when these muscles contract, now the volume is lower, so the pressure increases. So we've now got a high pressure in the tracheals, higher pressure in the tracheals, higher in the tracheals or in the trachea, lower pressure in the atmosphere, and the air moves down its pressure gradient from the trachea or from the tracheals and out again. Okay, and that is that ventilation. That ventilation continues, it repeats, and the repetition of ventilation maintains the concentration gradient for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so respiring cells use the oxygen, so there is also a low concentration of oxygen at the end of the tracheals. This also maintains that concentration gradient. Okay, so oxygen diffuses from the air, and by air we mean that air that's moved into the tracheals from the air, along the trachea and the tracheals, and into the cells. Okay, so we've got a higher concentration of oxygen here, a lower concentration here. We get that diffusion from the high concentration to the low concentration, and then even lower concentration in the cells. So the oxygen diffuses into the cells for respiration. Okay, so oxygen needs to diffuse into the cells. How is that concentration gradient created? Okay, so we've already mentioned this. Oxygen is used by those respiring cells at the end of the tracheals. That causes the low concentration here. And we've mentioned this already, the ventilation moves the air in. That fresh, or that air that has just moved in, will have a higher concentration of oxygen. On the flip side of that, carbon dioxide needs to diffuse out of the cells. So carbon dioxide is produced by the respiring cells at the end of those tracheals. So the respiring cells have the highest concentration, then the tracheals, so it moves from the cells into the tracheals, and then ventilation moves the carbon dioxide rich air out of the tracheals, out into the atmosphere. And then more air moves in, which would have a lower concentration of carbon dioxide, and that repeats. Okay, last couple of bits on this. So the insects and water, well, we've mentioned this already, that exoskeleton, which is very hard and waxy, minimises water loss. The spiracles close and they minimise evaporation. And we said that happens when they will close when the concentration of carbon dioxide is low. Okay, so the signal for the opening of the spiracles depends on, she said here, depends on the levels of carbon dioxide in the insect's body. Okay. Carbon dioxide levels rise due to respiration, causing the spiracles to open wider. At rest, when there's less respiration, the concentration of carbon dioxide will be lower and the spiracles close. Okay, one last little bit, and this really does confuse a lot, but it's fascinating, really. Really clever. Okay, so when an insect is experiencing really high activity or really increased activity, it's necessary for more oxygen to be transported or to diffuse from the tracheals and into respiring tissues. It's also necessary for carbon dioxide to move the other way. So what we have here is a tracheal system, the tracheal, spiracle, trachea, and a resting tissue. And what you might notice, colour in here, is there is a fluid at the end of those tracheals. Okay. Now that fluid at the end of that tracheal, if you notice, is in there is more of it. There's a greater volume of fluid in the resting tissue than there is in this active tissue. You might wonder why that is. The reason for that is because at really increased rates of activity in the active tissue, anaerobic respiration takes place. Respiration. And the product, or one of the products of anaerobic respiration, is lactic acid or lactate. Now, that lactic acid is present in the cells of this active tissue. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here. Let's have a look at one of those cells of the active tissue. Okay, so the lactic acid inside that cell accumulates. So we've got more, I've chosen a rubbish pen there. Let's use a different one. Add a pen. Oh, yeah. Bear with me. Okay, so with anaerobic respiration, there's an accumulation of lactic acid. Now, lactic acid lowers the water potential. That's a trident there to represent water potential. It lowers the water potential of the cells in that active tissue. Now, the water potential of the fluid is greater than the water potential of the tissue. So water moves in to the tissue by osmosis down that water potential gradient. Okay, so the increased lactic acid lowers the water potential. There's a higher water potential in that fluid, in the tracheal, than in the tissue. So water leaves the tracheal by osmosis into that tissue. Now, what we can see is that increases the surface area of these tracheals. So now these tracheals have a greater surface area for diffusion. Okay, if we compare the tracheals of the resting tissue, we can see they've got this surface area here. If we compare that, to the active tissue, much greater surface area. So we've got a larger surface area for diffusion. If we go all the way back to the start, you'll remember Fick's law. If we increase the surface area, we get a greater rate of diffusion. Okay, so there's greater rate of diffusion. That means more oxygen. More oxygen can diffuse. It's getting green again. So the oxygen is able to diffuse out of those tracheoles and into the active tissue to allow for more aerobic respiration. And that's great. I think that's amazing. So with the increased anaerobic respiration that might occur if there was increased activity, makes more lactic acid, lowers the water potential. Water moves out of the fluid by osmosis. That increases the surface area for diffusion, meaning more oxygen can enter the active tissue, which may prevent that anaerobic respiration from taking place, but also, if there's more oxygen, there would be more aerobic respiration. And aerobic respiration produces much more ATP than anaerobic. Okay, I think that's everything on that I was going to go through. If you have any further questions, feel free to send me an email or leave a message beneath and I will try to answer those for you. All the best. Cheers.